Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're traveling back into the ancient world, uncovering the ideas, strategies, and beliefs that shaped entire civilizations. For starters, we'll explore the ingenious farming techniques that allowed ancient China to produce infinite food, discover how the Carthaginians managed to destroy the largest Roman army ever assembled, and follow the incredible journey of indigenous Australians as they first colonized one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. And finally, we'll dive into one of history's most fascinating obsessions: why ancient Egypt built an entire civilization around defeating death. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the mysteries of the ancient world slowly unfold.
Imagine a farm that feeds itself. No fertilizer, no imported feed, no waste. Just one pond, producing fish, eggs, vegetables, and fertilizer endlessly. And the strangest part? Farmers in ancient China figured it out over 2,000 years ago. This farming system was so efficient, so perfectly balanced, that modern scientists still study it today. Fish, ducks, plants, insects, and microscopic bacteria all work together in a perfect ecological loop. Nothing was wasted. Everything became food. But here's the real mystery. How did ancient farmers create an ecosystem that modern agriculture still struggles to replicate? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Picture a quiet village in southern China nearly 2,000 years ago. Mist drifts across rice fields. Farmers walk narrow paths between ponds carved into the earth. At first glance, it looks ordinary. But look closer. Ducks glide across the water. Fish ripple beneath the surface. Lotus plants stretch toward the sun. Dragonflies hover overhead. This isn't just a pond. It's a living machine. One designed by farmers who understood something most of the world had forgotten. Nature wastes nothing. But here's the strange part. If you dropped a handful of fish into a pond today and waited, they'd probably starve. So how did ancient farmers manage to grow massive amounts of food from a single pond? The answer lies in something surprisingly simple. They didn't build a farm. They built an ecosystem. Everything began with ducks. At first, ducks might seem like an odd choice, but ducks were the engine of the system. As they swam across the pond, they did three important things. First, they ate insects and pests. Second, their movement stirred oxygen into the water. And third, they left behind waste. Normally, waste is a problem. But in this system, waste was the foundation. Duck waste fed microscopic algae and bacteria, tiny organisms invisible to the human eye. But they multiplied rapidly. Soon the pond water became rich with life, and that life became food for fish. Ancient Chinese farmers didn't just raise one type of fish, they raised multiple species at once. Each one occupied a different layer of the pond. Some fish fed near the surface, others grazed on algae, some searched the muddy bottom for nutrients. This technique is called polyculture. Instead of competition, each species filled a different ecological role. It was like stacking multiple farms on top of each other in the same water. But the system didn't stop there. Farmers realized something remarkable. The pond water itself had become incredibly rich in nutrients, so they began using it to irrigate nearby crops. Vegetables, rice, lotus roots. The water fertilized the soil naturally. No chemicals needed, and when rain washed nutrients back into the pond, the cycle started again. At this point, something incredible was happening. The farm had become self-sustaining. Ducks fed the pond fed the fish enriched the water fed the crops, and the crops supported the farmers. Nothing was wasted. Every byproduct became a resource. This wasn't just farming, It was ecological engineering centuries before the word existed. Today, we often think modern agriculture is the most advanced system humanity has ever created. But ancient Chinese farmers had already discovered something modern farming often ignores. Efficiency doesn't come from control, it comes from balance. These weren't tiny backyard experiments. Some villages managed entire networks of ponds, each pond connected to fields and canals. The system produced fish for protein, duck eggs for food, vegetables for nutrition, fertilizer for crops, all from the same ecosystem. For farmers with limited land, this method produced far more food per acre than traditional farming, and it required almost no external inputs, no synthetic fertilizer, no industrial feed, just the natural flow of nutrients. And here's something fascinating. Modern scientists studying these systems discovered that the ponds supported hundreds of microscopic species working together. Bacteria, zooplankton, algae, insects. Each one played a role in keeping the system balanced. Ancient farmers didn't know the science behind it, but through centuries of observation, they learned how to guide nature instead of fighting it. What makes this system so remarkable isn't just the food it produced, it's the philosophy behind it. Most agriculture works by simplifying nature, clearing ecosystems, growing a single crop, eliminating everything else. But this ancient system did the opposite. It embraced complexity. More species meant more stability. More stability meant more productivity. Nature wasn't the enemy, it was the partner. So if this system worked so well, why isn't the entire world farming this way today? Over the last century, agriculture changed dramatically. Industrial farming focused on speed and scale, large monoculture fields, synthetic fertilizers, heavy machinery. And while those systems can produce huge harvests, they often depend on massive external inputs, fuel, chemicals, artificial feed. The ancient pond system took a completely different approach. Instead of pouring energy into the farm, it allowed the ecosystem to generate energy itself. Ironically, many modern scientists are now rediscovering these ancient methods. Aquaculture researchers study traditional Chinese ponds to understand how they maintained productivity for centuries without collapsing. And what they're finding is astonishing. These ecosystems were incredibly resilient. They could recover from disturbances. They adapted to seasonal changes. And they remained productive generation after generation. So how did ancient farmers create a system that modern agriculture still struggles to replicate? The secret wasn't a technology, or a special crop, or even a clever design. It was a way of thinking. Instead of asking, how can we force the land to produce food? They asked a different question. How can we work with the systems that already exist? By observing nature closely, they turned a simple pond into a self-sustaining engine of life. Some of the most powerful innovations in human history weren't machines. They were ideas about how to live with the natural world. Ancient Chinese farmers understood something profound. When every part of an ecosystem supports the others, abundance isn't something you force. It's something that emerges naturally. And thousands of years later, that quiet pond ecosystem still holds a lesson the modern world may need more than ever. Because sometimes the future of food was already discovered in the past.
Imagine destroying an army twice your size. Not by fighting harder, not by having better weapons, but by carefully guiding the enemy into a trap of their own making. More than 2,000 years ago, a general named Hannibal used a strategy so brilliant that military academies still study it today. When the trap finally closed, tens of thousands of Roman soldiers suddenly realized they had nowhere left to run. But what makes this story truly fascinating is that the Roman army wasn't inexperienced, and it certainly wasn't poorly equipped. In fact, it was the largest army Rome had ever assembled. So, how could a smaller force completely surround and destroy it? The answer lies in one of the most remarkable battlefield strategies ever executed, a plan so carefully designed that the Romans didn't even realize what was happening until it was far too late. To understand this strategy, we first need to understand the situation Hannibal faced. At the time, Rome was the most powerful republic in the Mediterranean world. Its armies were disciplined, relentless, and incredibly difficult to defeat. But Hannibal had already shocked Rome by winning two major battles earlier in the war. The Romans were furious and determined to end the conflict quickly. So they gathered an army on a scale they had never attempted before. 86,000 soldiers, heavy infantry, battle-hardened veterans confident in their strength. It was the largest Roman army assembled at that point in their history. Hannibal, meanwhile, had only about 50,000 men. At first glance, the outcome seemed obvious. Rome should have crushed him. But Hannibal had something far more powerful than numbers. He had a plan. Before the battle even began, Hannibal made a decision that might have seemed reckless. He deliberately weakened the center of his army. Normally, the center of a battle line is its strongest point. If the center collapses, the entire army can fall apart. Yet Hannibal did the opposite. He placed his strongest and most experienced troops on the edges of the battlefield and left the center comparatively thin. At first, this seems like a dangerous gamble. Why would any general weaken the most important part of his formation? The answer reveals the true genius of Hannibal's strategy. He wasn't trying to stop the Roman advance, he was trying to control it. Meanwhile, the Romans had their own plan, and it was a very Roman plan: simple, direct, and aggressive. Roman generals believed their heavy infantry was the strongest fighting force in the world, so they decided to use that strength like a hammer. Their strategy was to smash directly through the center of Hannibal's line. Once the enemy's center collapsed, Roman soldiers could turn left and right and destroy the remaining Carthaginian forces. To make this work, they packed their infantry into a massive formation. Thousands of soldiers shoulder to shoulder, moving forward together like a solid wall of shields and spears. If that formation broke through the enemy line, the battle would likely be over. And that was exactly what Hannibal was counting on. The two armies met near the town of Cannae on a wide open plain in southern Italy. Flat ground, almost no obstacles, exactly the kind of battlefield Roman generals preferred. They believed open terrain favored their disciplined infantry, but Hannibal saw something different. He saw a battlefield perfectly suited for a trap. The battle began with cavalry. Hannibal's horsemen attacked aggressively on the Roman flank, and here he had a critical advantage. His cavalry was stronger, more experienced, and far more aggressive. Within minutes, the Roman cavalry began to collapse. Many were killed, and others fled the battlefield entirely. This moment was crucial because now Hannibal's cavalry was free to maneuver, free to move across the battlefield, and free to return later when the trap was ready to close. Meanwhile, in the center of the battlefield, something subtle was happening. As the Roman infantry advanced, Hannibal's center began to slowly retreat. To the Roman soldiers, this looked like victory. They believed they were breaking through the enemy line, so they pushed forward harder, deeper, and further into Hannibal's formation. But this retreat wasn't panic, and it wasn't collapse. It was completely intentional. Hannibal had ordered his center to give ground slowly, just enough to pull the Roman army forward, just enough to stretch their formation, and just enough to guide them exactly where he wanted them. As the Romans advanced, Hannibal's battle line began to change shape. At the beginning of the fight, his line curved outward toward the Romans, but as the center retreated, the formation slowly bent inward. Imagine a bowl forming on the battlefield. The Romans were moving deeper and deeper into that bowl, and without realizing it, they were walking straight into a trap. Then came the decisive moment. Hannibal's strongest troops, positioned on the wings of his army, suddenly moved. But they didn't advance forward. They pivoted inward. Both sides of the Carthaginian army began pressing into the exposed flanks of the Roman formation. Suddenly, the Roman army was no longer attacking. It was being attacked from both sides. But the trap still wasn't complete, because Hannibal's cavalry had been waiting. After defeating the Roman horsemen earlier in the battle, they rode behind the Roman army and struck from the rear. Now the Romans were surrounded on every side, front, back, left, and right. The entire army had been encircled. You might wonder why the Romans didn't simply break out. The answer lies in their own strategy. Remember the dense formation they used? It worked well when pushing forward, but once surrounded, it became a prison. Soldiers were packed so tightly together that many couldn't even swing. Some couldn't move at all. The very formation designed to win the battle had now sealed their fate. Inside the Roman ranks, confusion quickly turned into panic. Orders couldn't travel through the crowded formation. Officers couldn't see what was happening around them. Soldiers slowly realized they were trapped. Carthaginian troops began pressing inward from every direction, slowly tightening the circle around the Roman army until resistance finally collapsed. The scale of the disaster was enormous. Of the 86,000 Roman soldiers who marched into battle, only a few thousand escaped. Tens of thousands were killed and thousands more were captured. It was one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. But what makes the Battle of Cannae truly extraordinary is not just the scale of the victory, it's the elegance of the strategy. Hannibal didn't rely on superior numbers. He relied on understanding his enemy. He knew exactly how the Romans preferred to fight. He knew they would push forward aggressively, and he used the confidence against them. Every step of the battle guided the Romans exactly where he wanted them to go. The retreat, the curve formation, the attack from the wings, and the final cavalry strike. Each piece of the plan worked together like a carefully designed machine. So how did a smaller army destroy one of the largest forces Rome had ever assembled? The answer's surprisingly simple. Hannibal didn't surround the Roman army. He allowed the Romans to surround themselves. By controlling their movement, he turned their own momentum into the trap. More than 2,000 years later, the Battle of Cannae remains one of the most studied battles in military history because it reveals something timeless about strategy. Victory doesn't always belong to the strongest army. Sometimes it belongs to the commander who understands the battlefield better than anyone else. And on that day, Hannibal didn't just defeat Rome's greatest army, he demonstrated one of the most brilliant battlefield strategies the world has ever seen. Imagine arriving in a land where the sun can kill you, a place where rivers disappear, the soil fights your crops, and drought can last for years. Now imagine surviving there, not for a decade, not for centuries, but for more than 60,000 years. Long before European ships reached Australia, indigenous Australians had already mastered one of the harshest environments on Earth. But when the British arrived in the late 1700s, something extraordinary happened. The newcomers nearly starved in a land where people had already been surviving for tens of thousands of years. So the question is, How did Indigenous Australians survive here for so long? And why did the British struggle so badly when they first arrived? At first glance, the answer seems simple: different technology, different culture. But the real explanation is far more fascinating, because survival in Australia wasn't about conquering the land, it was about understanding it. And when the British arrived, they brought an entirely different way of thinking about nature, a way that would transform the continent forever. But before we get there, we need to go back to the beginning. More than 60,000 years ago, the first humans arrived on the continent we now call Australia. They came by sea, traveling across ancient coastlines when sea levels were lower than they are today. When they arrived, they encountered a land unlike anywhere else. Massive deserts stretched across the center of the continent. Rainfall was unpredictable. Some years rivers flooded, other years they vanished completely. For newcomers, this landscape might seem hostile, even impossible to survive in. But over thousands of generations, Indigenous Australians developed something far more powerful than tools. They developed knowledge. Today, archaeologists believe that Aboriginal Australians represent one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. Some traditions have been passed down for tens of thousands of years. That means their understanding of the environment was built slowly, generation by generation. Instead of forcing the land to produce food in one place, indigenous communities often moved with the seasons. Different regions produced different resources at different times of the year. Fish during one season, seeds during another, fruit, roots, insects, and small animals during others. Survival depended on knowing where food would appear and when. And that knowledge was stored in stories. Many early European explorers believed Australia was an empty wilderness. But that wasn't true. The land had been carefully managed for thousands of years. One of the most important tools used by Indigenous Australians was fire. Small, controlled burns were used to shape the landscape. These fires cleared old vegetation and encouraged fresh plant growth. That new growth attracted grazing animals, which made hunting easier. Over time, this practice reshaped entire ecosystems. Modern researchers sometimes call it fire stick farming. But to the people who practiced it, it wasn't farming. It was simply part of living with the land. So if people had already mastered this environment, what happened when Europeans arrived? In 1770, a British naval officer named James Cook sailed along Australia's eastern coastline. He claimed the land for Britain, but at first no settlements were built. That changed after Britain lost its American colonies. Suddenly, the British government needed somewhere new to send prisoners. The solution was a distant continent on the other side of the world. In 1788, 11 ships arrived carrying more than 1,000 people, convicts, soldiers, officials. This group became known as the First Fleet, and they established a settlement at a place called Sydney Cove. But here's the strange part: the settlers nearly starved. The soil around Sydney was poor. European crops didn't grow well. The climate behaved in unfamiliar ways. And supply ships from Britain could take months to arrive. Within the first few years, the colony faced the real possibility of collapse. The settlers had arrived in a land that seemed impossible to farm. Yet all around them lived people who had survived there for tens of thousands of years. So why didn't the British simply learn from Indigenous Australians? The answer lies in two very different ways of seeing the world. Indigenous Australians understood the land as a living system. Food was spread across landscapes, plants, animals, seasons, and water sources were connected. But the British arrived with a different idea. They believed survival depended on controlling nature, clearing land, planting crops, building permanent farms. These systems worked well in Europe, but Australia was not Europe. Ironically, the environment that indigenous Australians had mastered for millennia was the same environment that nearly destroyed the first European settlement. As the colony slowly grew, settlers began expanding outward. They searched for better farmland, better water sources, more resources, but expansion brought them into direct conflict with indigenous communities. Land that had been used for hunting and gathering for thousands of years was suddenly fenced off. Water sources were claimed. Animals like sheep and cattle transformed fragile ecosystems. And as settlers spread across the continent, violence erupted in many regions. These conflicts are sometimes called the Australian Frontier Wars. Disease also played a devastating role. Illnesses introduced by Europeans spread rapidly through indigenous populations that had never encountered them before. Entire communities were affected. Despite these enormous challenges, indigenous cultures did not disappear. In remote parts of the continent, communities maintained traditional ways of life. Languages, art, and stories continued to be passed down. And over time, researchers began to realize something remarkable. Many indigenous land management techniques were not primitive. They were extraordinarily sophisticated. Controlled burning, for example, is now being studied as a way to reduce massive wildfires. Some scientists believe the absence of traditional burning practices may actually contribute to the severity of modern bushfires. In other words, knowledge developed over tens of thousands of years is now helping researchers rethink how we manage ecosystems. So, why were indigenous Australians able to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth for so long, while the first British settlers struggled? The answer isn't technology, it isn't strength, it's understanding. For tens of thousands of years, indigenous Australians learned how to work with the rhythms of the land. They observed it, adapted to it, and shaped it carefully over generations. When the British arrived, they brought systems designed for a completely different environment. And for a time, those systems nearly failed. The difference between survival and disaster wasn't simply knowledge of tools, it was knowledge of the land itself. Today, Australia is a modern nation built on layers of history. But the story of the continent didn't begin with European ships arriving on its shores. It began tens of thousands of years earlier, with people who learned how to read the landscape like a map, who understood the movement of seasons, and who discovered how to survive in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Because sometimes the most powerful technology humanity ever develops is not a machine, it's knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Imagine dying and discovering that death was only the first step of a much longer journey. A journey through a dark and dangerous underworld filled with gates, monsters, and divine judges. Now imagine believing that if you prepared properly, if the rituals were correct, if the spells were spoken, you could live forever. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end of life, it was the beginning of eternity. And because of that belief, they built an entire civilization around preparing for the afterlife. But here's the strange part. Preparing for eternity wasn't just a religious belief, it became an industry. thousands of people worked full-time helping the dead reach the next world. Priests performed rituals, embalmers preserved bodies, artists painted coffins, architects built elaborate tombs deep in the desert. Entire villages existed solely to prepare the dead for the afterlife. So why did the ancient Egyptians invest so much time, wealth, and labor into preparing for death? To understand that, we need to follow the journey they believed every soul would take. The journey began the moment a person died. According to Egyptian belief, the human soul did not simply disappear. Instead, it split into different spiritual parts. Two of the most important were the Ka and the Ba. The Ka was the life force, the energy that made a person alive. The Ba was something closer to personality or spirit. After death, these parts separated from the body, but they still needed it because the soul was expected to return. This is where the first major challenge appeared. If the body decayed, the soul could be lost forever. This is why Egyptians became obsessed with preserving the body. Without a preserved body, the soul had nowhere to return. Eternal life would be impossible. To prevent decay, the Egyptians developed one of the most famous burial practices in history: mummification. But mummification was not a simple ritual. It was a complicated process that took around 70 days to complete. First, embalmers carefully removed the internal organs: the liver, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines. These organs were placed into special containers called canopic jars, each protected by a different god. The heart, however, was left inside the body, because it would soon play a very important role. Many people assume mummification was only for pharaohs, but over time, many Egyptians who could afford it also chose to be mummified. Preparing for eternity wasn't just royal, it became a business. After the organs were removed, the body was covered in a natural salt called natron. This salt slowly drew moisture from the body, drying it out and preventing decay. After weeks of drying, embalmers carefully wrapped the body in layers of linen bandages. Between these layers, they placed amulets, small protective charms meant to guard the deceased during their journey through the underworld. Each amulet had a purpose. Some protected the heart, others protected the soul from demons, others helped the deceased breathe again in the afterlife. But preserving the body was only the beginning, because once the burial was complete, the real journey began. The ancient Egyptians believed the soul would travel through a mysterious realm known as the Duat. This was the Egyptian underworld, but it was not a place of eternal punishment like many later ideas of hell. Instead, it was a dangerous passage filled with trials. The soul would encounter strange creatures, massive gates guarded by supernatural beings, and mysterious pathways through darkness. Without help, the journey could be impossible. So the Egyptians created something remarkable: a guidebook for the dead. Buried alongside many Egyptians was a collection of magical texts known today as the Book of the Dead. Despite its name, it was not a single book. Instead, it was a collection of spells, instructions, and prayers. Each spell was designed to help the soul overcome a specific danger in the Duat. Some spells helped the soul avoid demons, others allowed the dead to transform into animals or birds to escape danger. Some gave the deceased the power to speak secret words that opened guarded gates. In a way, it was like a map through the afterlife, a survival guide for eternity. And writing these spells was itself an entire profession. Scribes spent their lives copying and customizing these texts for tombs. Another part of the afterlife industry. By this point, preparing for the afterlife had become one of the most important parts of Egyptian society. Embalmers preserved bodies, priests performed ceremonies, stoneworkers carved tombs, painters decorated burial chambers, goldsmiths crafted jewelry and amulets, and scribes wrote the spells that would guide the soul through the underworld. Entire communities existed just to support this work. One famous example is Deir el Medina, a village where the artisans who built royal tombs lived. These workers spent their lives carving elaborate burial chambers for pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings. In other words, preparing for death became one of the largest economic systems in ancient Egypt. The afterlife wasn't just a belief, it was an industry. After surviving the dangers of the Duat, the soul eventually reached its final destination, a grand hall presided over by the god Osiris. Here the soul would face judgment, and everything came down to a single moment, the weighing of the heart. The heart of the deceased was placed on a scale. On the other side of the scale was a single feather, the feather of Maat, representing truth and justice. If the heart was light, free from wrongdoing, the scales would balance, and the soul would be allowed to enter eternal paradise, a perfect world known as the Field of Reeds, a place where life continued forever. But if the heart was heavy with guilt, the outcome was far worse. A terrifying creature called Amit waited beside the scales, part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. If the scales tipped the wrong way, Amit devoured the heart, and the soul ceased to exist forever. This moment of judgment was the ultimate goal of every preparation. The tomb, the mummification, the spells, the rituals, everything led to this single test, because if the heart passed the weighing, the journey was complete, and eternity awaited. So why did the ancient Egyptians build pyramids, tombs, and elaborate burial rituals? Why did they invest enormous resources preparing for death? Because they believed death was not the end. It was simply the doorway to another life. And with the right preparation, that life could last forever. For the ancient Egyptians, the afterlife was not a distant hope. It was a destination they carefully prepared for. Their beliefs shaped their religion, their economy, their art, and even the architecture that still amazes the world today. Because when an entire civilization believes that eternity awaits beyond death, preparing for that journey becomes one of the most important things a society can do. And in ancient Egypt, death was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Still awake? If you are, thank you for spending this quiet time with us, exploring the ancient world together. But now it's time to let your mind rest. We hope this journey through history helped you slow down, unwind, and drift a little closer to sleep. And we hope you get the deep rest you need to conquer your day tomorrow. Until next time, sleep well and good night.